Kicking off this interview, I really wanted to pick your brain on this idea of what are the behaviors or what are the values of leadership, right? And what does that look like? Are there any common denominators? And, clearly you had mentioned this idea of really knowing your values, being committed and consistent, and then making decisions based on those values. And then have that personal philosophy. And so, and then, I wanted to have you share with our listeners, understanding the leadership and your values within a certain context and how to approach leadership that's most productive for that environment is one thing, but good leaders, it's also about leadership growth, right? Mm-hmm. So I really love what you said, because my next question was, well, how can you nurture that? How can you continue to grow as a leadership and develop over time? And you just wonderfully just kind of laid it out. I mean, it's, you have these 3 pieces of advice, you reverse engineering. And by doing that, what you're doing is you continue to reflect on your values. You just had mentioned, well, what comes out of the wash in that exercise, it's probably all going to tie back to these values that we talked about in the first, 2 or 3 questions of this conversation.
Yeah. And then there's one more step that you take to go beyond that, which is once you know what the values are by reverse engineering them, you try to make sure you live them every day, not just when the chance happens. So when I did that process, I came up with, just to be specific, impact was the 6 values that started coming up for me were impact, growth, courage, empowerment, class, and self-respect. And so what I constantly do is every day I get up in the morning and I say, in order to earn another day on this planet, you could do this with your job, in order to not get fired at the end of today, I need to prove that I lived 3 out of these 6 values today. Something I did intentionally live these values. And what I discovered, and what we discovered at the university, was there's an easier way to sort of prompt your mind to do that. And it's, instead of having goals, you have questions that need to be answered. And there's psychological, I'm not going to dive into the psychological phenomena, but basically if you turn a goal into a question, you're more likely to do it. So if every day I wanted to get up and have impact by making someone feel better off for having interacted with me, just having one interaction that sends them away feeling better, I can put that on my to-do list, but I'll get distracted. I'll fall into the pattern that I've done for my whole life, which is I got to get everything done for everybody. But if I turn that value of impact into a question, what did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership, is one of my 6 questions I have every day. Well, the research shows that that question will cause your brain to be so uncomfortable because it doesn't have an answer that it will constantly be on the lookout for a chance to answer the question. And so if I go out there every day and my brain is going to feel crappy with this question, what have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? I will feel uncomfortable until that question is answered. And so what happens is every time I see somebody behave in a way that says that deserves to be recognized as leadership, as impactful, as empowering, whatever it was, my brain goes, oh, thank God, here's my chance to answer the question. And so I go through every day with 6 questions tied to my values. What did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership for impact? What did I do today to make it more likely someone would learn something for growth? What did I do today that might not work, but I tried it anyway for courage? What did I do today to move someone else closer to a goal for empowerment? When did I elevate a situation that I could have escalated for class? Elevate means trying to succeed. Escalate means trying to win. And self-respect was, what have I done today to be good to myself? What have I done today to make myself stronger is another one. And every day, to earn another day on the planet, I got to answer 3 of those 6 questions. And what I encourage every leader to do is, in the midst of everything else that you have to do and all the uncertainty that gets thrown at you every day, take the time to say, these are the values I want to be able to say I lived every day. Turn them into questions that become an expectation that you have for yourself every day. You create your own test, and then you put those questions in your phone to pop up at, say, noon and 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. They just keep reminding your brain that it's an expectation that you'll get this question answered. How did I move someone else closer to a goal today? I haven't done that yet. I got to make sure that I take the time to do that on top of everything else I want to get done today. Every day I have a leadership test tied to my core values that I try to live. And the reason it works is that your brain hates unanswered questions. And what I've done is you take your values and you break it down into a question. And then you ask yourself a tiny number of questions every day. The number of questions are small, but the impact of the commitment is huge. And I got it from the one thing every single day. Are you going to have a drink today? I am not. Can I make that same decision tomorrow? I don't know. I do know I've made it this many days, 2,879 days in a row, but that doesn't matter if you don't make it today. So, this idea that to strip everything else away and just have certain non negotiable behaviors that have to be a part of every day, I have found that some of the highest performing people can identify any non negotiables that they do tied to their values every day. They might get up every day and do a run that's tied to their physical fitness. They don't tie that back to a value. I'm encouraging everyone listening, amongst everything else you have to get done in your job, make sure you identify non negotiable moments where you can live the values that you claim drive you as a professional every day. Because otherwise, they're just words. You're claiming that you stand for them. We need to be able to prove it to ourselves. It's what makes us better leaders of other people. It's what makes us better at empowering other people. When we can look in the mirror and know that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, isn't a lie. Because let's face it, man, you know that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, is almost always followed by a lie.
Yeah.
I guess my work is to say to people, I don't know what your leadership calls for every day, but I do know if you're lying to yourself when you say, I'm the type of person who, it always catches up with you and it makes you worse at your job. So I try to encourage people to do certain things that, regardless of what their leadership calls for, it will provide them with strength and guidance in difficult times, regardless of what those scenarios are. There are certain aspects of our leadership that must stay the same. I claim it's our values, because if we're going to use our values as decision making criteria, the only way we make consistent decisions is to keep our criteria consistent. That's impossible if we don't know what it is. That was a long answer, and I'm really sorry, brother.
No, Drew, that is great. Thank you. And, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, what are some of the common challenges? Because everybody wants to be a better leader, right? I think, and if you don't, then, if you're a leader and you don't want to try to be a better leader, then,
You're
an
not listening to
interesting.
you're
Yeah.
not listening to this podcast if that's the
Yeah.
case.
But what are some of the common challenges that leaders face as they grow, and how can they overcome them? Was a question I had for you, but I think you already answered that, Drew, because is it really just the basic blocking and tackling? This idea of just being deliberate and intentful with this reflection of these 30 pieces of advice, and then breaking those into values, and then you turn those into these daily questions and essentially affirmations, right? By asking yourself these questions, you reinforce, am I living up to these values? So is that how leaders kind of overcome challenges and continue to develop? Is it just, I mean, I'm not saying that it's simple, because it's not. I mean, to do this in reality, I
Yeah.
think tactically is a challenge. But I mean, that just sounds like fantastic advice. I mean, just basic blocking and tackling, and just find a way to live up to your values by asking these questions that you have been deliberate on and reflected in, and try to get yourself answers to these questions every single day.
Yeah, I never heard it called blocking and tackling. I like it. Yeah, I mean, it's one tool. I'll be straight with you on that. This is one tool that I use. There's a million different factors, and there's no just anything.
Mhm.
But this is one thing I do to try. There's so much noise and responsibility of being a leader that it's hard to focus on any one thing. And so, what I try to talk about is, okay, well, here's something we can control. And my hope is that resonates with some people, being like, okay, well, that's something I can add to my life in order to be more deliberate without having to change anything dramatically. The number one challenge that I think most leaders are overlooking, or that number one tool that I think could be useful, is we don't put enough focus on accountability and getting help with accountability. So in my life, I've lost 100 pounds more than once. Unfortunately, that says something about how easy it is to gain it back.
Mm.
I've lost 100 pounds. I've tried to take care of my mental health after I was diagnosed as having bipolar. And one of the things I learned is that when you're a high performer, there's almost a satisfaction that comes from doing it on your own, because you know that it makes people look at you and say, oh, wow, I can't do that. And we know that when we can do things other people can't do, that we get rewarded for it. What I will say to everyone listening is that to surround yourself with a small number of people for whom you have a great deal of respect, but that you give them permission to annoy you, that's the definition of accountability partners. Everything that you do, living your values, being more physically active, spending more time with your family, whatever commitment you make, is usually not going to come through if the only person to whom you make that commitment is yourself. And so, what I also encourage people to do is when you identify these are the values I want to be able to live, I want to be able to prove to myself that I did it. Here are my questions every day. Make sure that you enlist someone else, often someone you don't work with, someone else who you respect and who would be willing to give of their time just a little bit to hold you accountable to what you're doing. So if I say I'm going to answer 3 out of 6 questions every day, I have somebody who reaches out to me every day and says, what were your 3 questions? And who I've given permission to give me crap if I
Yeah.
consistently don't do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So one of the factors that not enough leaders do, whatever strategy you've been trying to implement to make yourself a better leader, do it as a group. Find 2 or 3 other people who have the same sort of interest in getting something done or improving in a certain way or exploring some new strategy on how to be better, and give them permission to piss you off. To say, when I don't do this, I don't want you to let it go. I want you to make me feel bad. And that has been a huge thing for me, to have a small group of 3 or 4 people that we work together to hold each other accountable. And it is seen as a sign of great respect when I reached out to people and said, would you be the person who would be willing to make sure I do this every day? Because I think enough of you and what you accomplish to think you can help me reach my goals. What can I do to help you reach yours? I'm telling you, high performing people need to spend more time getting together into accountability groups. Once you form accountability groups, you would be absolutely amazed at what kind of additional strength, what kind of additional confidence, and just straight up how many better decisions you make and how much more committed you are to the toughest stuff. I really believe that.
Yeah.
The thing that all of us are facing is this tendency to try to face things alone. And if you're listening to this, no, enlist the 3 people that you trust and respect the most and say, I want to accomplish this. I'm not doing it on my own. Will you help me? I guarantee you, if you just take that piece of advice, everything else I've said this entire podcast pales in comparison to that.
And Drew, isn't this advice that you're giving to our listeners today, and this idea of reflection and the 30 pieces of advice, and how do you break that down into values, and then asking the right questions, and then being accountable, right? Having somebody that you give, you allow them to call BS on
Yeah.
your answers to your questions on a daily basis. But can't that same approach, isn't that scalable? And can't leaders use that to foster a culture of values-driven leadership within their organization?
Without a doubt. I'll be
Yeah.
honest with you, man. The biggest mistake leaders make with this is they try to go too fast. They try to come up with 6 values and 6 questions right away. I encourage you to pick one. Like, pick one value, create one question, and it's not even an affirmation. It actually is psychologically impactful that when you put a question in your brain, it will keep working at it, trying to find an answer. It's why you remember the name of that actor or actress 2 days after you gave up remembering the name. Your brain keeps hammering at it. So, like, I think a big piece of what I try to talk about is recognizing that it has to happen in stages. And if you want, as you just said, yes, this can become a culture of value driven leadership and value driven decision making, but it cannot be implemented from the top down. It has to be demonstrated from the top down. And when you're transparent as a leader who, let's face it, has authority over other people, and they see you saying, these are the values I care about, and these are the questions I'm going to try to answer every day. Only once you've demonstrated that you're doing it is it easier to then say to other people, here's what I've been doing. I'd like us to do it together. Because if you ask your team to everyone bring in some piece of edge of the bed advice, that in and of itself is an amazing exercise to help people better understand who they work with and what drives them. The same if you want to start a discussion about values within your team and how you're going to make decisions and better understand what people are using to make decisions. Give them all a list of 12 values that are applicable to your particular organization or your group or your department, and ask them to rank them individually at home. Look, we know they're all good, but if you had to rank these in importance from 1 to 12, what would you do? Then have everybody come together on the team and say, great, you have half an hour to come up with a consensus ranking based on your individual rankings. Go. And honestly, my friends, the final rankings aren't important. What's important is that somebody who has integrity ranked number 1 and fun ranked number 12, and someone they work with who has fun ranked number 2 and integrity ranked number 10, they're going to have something to talk about. But I'll tell you, discussing differences in values when it's all an exercise as opposed to it's come up because of a conflict is way, way more beneficial. So, this discussion amongst yourself and amongst your people as to what values drive them and what they mean is absolutely essential. And simply discussing what values mean and how they impact any workplace is a huge step forward because most people don't talk about them. And if they do, it's in the context of assigning company values to employees. We're much better off talking about what are the values that drive the people we work with. And that asking them to figure out what they are and the discussion creates a stronger team simply in the discussion. But none of that can happen until you start doing it yourself. All this stuff has to happen in stages.